have a couple of people who will be absent. Since did not take volunteers for this week, did I? However, nonetheless, we have some notes. So I wanted to recall for us again the Theologico-political fragment. Just as our kind of touchstone and introduction. So you'll see that the second thesis on the concept of history, the second of the theses on the philosophy of history, kind of covers some similar ground as this. The provenance of this piece, I think that I mentioned previously, is uncertain. It's either very early Benjamin or it's late Benjamin. So it's unclear. Nonetheless, because there is so much overlap with that second thesis on the concept of history essay, it would appear that it might be closer, even though it has some references that would indicate early Benjamin, namely Bloch's Spirit of Utopia. And we're going to have to call back to 2 weeks ago when we did Nietzsche on the use and abuse of history for life to keep these in dialogue with each other and help us with on the concept of history piece. So only the Messiah himself consummates all history. Now that's going to be important. Consummates all history, accumulates all history, condenses all history. That's going to be an important figure for us. In the sense that he alone redeems, completes, creates its relation to the Messianic. All right, so there are kind of two different categories here. There's the Messianic, the Messiah, the Messianic, and history. For this reason, nothing historical can relate itself on its own account to anything Messianic. Therefore, the kingdom of God is not the telos of the historical dynamic. It cannot be set as a goal. From the standpoint of history, it is not the goal, but the end. Therefore, the order of the profane cannot be built up on the idea of the divine kingdom, and therefore theocracy has no political but only religious meaning. To have repudiated with utmost vehemence the political significance of theocracy is the cardinal merit of Bloch's Spirit of Utopia. So Ernst Bloch is part of the same group of people, like Lukács and Benjamin himself, who was converted to Marxism by the Russian Revolution. So Spirit of Utopia predates that. Okay, so the profane realm, which is the historical realm, the secular realm, the temporal realm. Right, so history exists in time. The Messiah exists outside of time, outside of history. So in Christian terms, Jesus said, "Render unto Caesar what Caesar is due, but render unto God what God is due." And where does that come from? It comes from the fact that they are under Roman occupation. So respect the temporal political authorities, respect the Roman authorities. He's not there to lead a revolution against the Romans. He's not. Definitely not. There were revolts against the Romans. Jesus is not doing that. He's saying, regardless of the political situation, render unto God what God is due. So separating the secular from the celestial, separating the political, the temporal, from the divine. It's very important. Auguste Comte, who's a utopian socialist and the father of positivism in the 19th century, he's also the coiner of the term social relations that Marx uses, attributed this distinction in early Christianity the separation of the temporal and the celestial, political authority from divine authority, he suggested that that was the fundamental emancipation that led to modern society. That this is what distinguished the West and what made it possible for all the historical development of the bourgeois era. So that's in the 19th century that Kant had that idea. Okay. So Benjamin agrees with all that. That's the point. He agrees with all that. The order of the profane, meaning the political, the temporal, the historical realm, should be erected on the idea of happiness. So not divinity, but happiness. The relation of this order to the Messianic is one of the essential teachings of the philosophy of history. Namely, it's a mystery. Right? It is the precondition of a mystical conception of history, containing a problem that can be represented figuratively. If one arrow points to the goal towards which the profane dynamic acts, and another marks the direction of messianic intensity, then certainly the quest of free humanity for happiness, otherwise known as the pursuit of happiness in the Declaration of Independence, runs counter to the messianic direction. But just as a force can, through acting, increase another that is acting in the opposite direction, so the order of the profane assists, through being profane, the coming of the messianic kingdom. The profane, therefore, although not itself a category of this kingdom, is a decisive category of its quietist approach. Okay, so what he's setting up here, so the arrow, the force that can affect the opposite force. This is like physics, right? Happiness and redemption. So this is the, let's say, messianic. It's also, we could say, the ancient. It is the sacred or celestial, to use Christian, like eternal, like the stars. Celestial authority, that's what the Pope has. The Pope has celestial authority. He doesn't have merely temporal authority, he has celestial authority.
Can we say that it is epic as well?
Epic?
Yeah.
Sure. What makes you say that? Because of in the theses?
Yeah.
All right, right.
And Brecht as well, like.
Yeah, Brecht is tricky though, right? It's like ironical. We talked about the fact that he calls it epic theater, but it's kind of like, oh wait, he's a Marxist, modern. What does that mean? Okay, so we have the messianic and we have the historical, which is the modern. So we also have the category of redemption, but we'll see that it's a different matter that requires redemption. Right, so the historical is the profane, the temporal, and political. In happiness, all that is earthly seeks its downfall, and only in good fortune is its downfall destined to find it. Whereas admittedly, in the immediate messianic intensity of the heart of the inner man in isolation passes through misfortune as suffering, to the spiritual restitutio in integrum, which introduces immortality, so that's being resurrected in the body, corresponds a worldly restitution that leads to the eternity of downfall. Meaning, how does the world renew itself? Through downfall. And the rhythm of this eternally transient worldly existence, transient in its totality, in its spatial, but also in its temporal totality, the rhythm of messianic nature is happiness. For nature is messianic by reason of its eternal and total passing away. To strive after such passing, even for those stages of man that are nature, is the task of world politics, whose method must be called nihilism. So this is the difference is what we're suffering from. We're suffering from unfreedom or suffering from unhappiness? Of course, both. So in terms of suffering from unhappiness, only God can redeem that. Politics cannot. Right, there is no political reparation or restoration possible for the unhappiness suffered by humans. Right, never going to be able to redeem slavery, genocide of Native Americans, the Holocaust. No, that's only God can redeem that. So what can be redeemed? Unfreedom. Why? Because, of course, freedom is the dynamic of history. Right? The pursuit of happiness. So freedom is something that exists in history. It develops, it changes, it transforms. That is what history is. Hegel. History is progress in consciousness of freedom. We looked at the Hegel, the slaughter bench. Did we look at the Hegel slaughter bench? We did not? Okay. So we didn't do W.E.B. Du Bois on Reconstruction. But that means that we also did the Hegel. Yeah, we did do the Hegel. Yeah. Okay, good. Because, again, Du Bois was a Hegelian. And studied in Germany with Hegelians, with bona fide Hegelians, right? And he also was affected by them because they were right Hegelians and race Hegelians, right? So he was just like, what is the historical mission of the black people, right? What does Hegel tell us about that? It's late 19th century, late 1800s, so it's academic Hegelianism is total German nationalist Hegelianism, total. And so it's nationalism, and it's kind of romantic nationalism, and the idea is that every people should discover their Volksgeist, right? The spirit of the people, and that's their history. So for better or for worse, Du Bois was a Hegelian. It led him to become a Marxist, which again, for better or for worse. But he's a contemporary of Benjamin. Du Bois is a contemporary of Benjamin. Remember that. They're contemporaries. Du Bois is a little bit older, but still they're basically contemporaries. They're writing in the 20s and 30s. Du Bois also a little bit before that. Okay, so this is what we're concerned with. We're not really concerned with this. This is religion. Not politics. Right? Religion is not nihilism. Religion is the opposite of nihilism. Politics might be nihilism. Again, a very Hegelian idea, which is that political change, this kind of motor of history, what is driving this progress in consciousness of freedom? Politics. However, politics is not moral. It's not moral. Never has been, never will be. I mentioned to you guys Napoleon and Goethe. We talked about Napoleon and Goethe, right? So Napoleon summons Goethe, and is like, white people still believe in destiny. Why do they still watch tragedies as if there's some divine destiny being revealed? It's like, there's no destiny, there's only politics. That is true. Benjamin agrees. Right? And from that standpoint, it looks like nihilism. In other words, from a theological standpoint, it looks like nihilism. So, religion and politics are not reconcilable. Freedom means breaking religion. Repudiate with utmost vehemence the political significance of theocracy. All right. Otherwise, we're going to be super confused, as most readers of Benjamin have been. They have been very confused about his piece that we spent the entire semester building towards.
Chris, sorry, hi, do you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead, Pablo.
Did you say freedom means breaking from religion?
Yes. Absolutely.
Why?
Well, it just has meant that historically, meaning the power of the church had to be broken to have bourgeois society.
So, isn't it very Nietzschean too? Like the Antichrist, is it like the same idea?
It is. Now, of course, with Nietzsche, it's always tricky how to deal with the rhetoric, meaning Marxism's a lot more straightforward about this, whereas Nietzsche is very veiled and performative and weird. Meaning, like, Nietzsche's he's Dionysus, he's the Antichrist, he's whatever, And it's like, and it's a little bit overwrought, right? Because his father was some kind of a Protestant minister, and his mother was some crazy kind of holy roller type Christian. And so he's very, but he's also aware of, we could say, the pathos of it. In other words, he's not just naively anti-Christian, right? But where were you going with that? Pablo, what did you have in mind?
Oh no, it's because I didn't hear well.
Okay.
I didn't know if you said freedom means breaking from religion or not, but you said yes, so it's all clear things.
So I'll just tell you guys, like in my lifetime, right? When I arrived on the left in the 1980s, what was going on? What were the issues? So there were many issues. There was apartheid South Africa. There was Central American Revolution. There was liberation theology. There was Desmond Tutu. Right? There were the Sandinistas. There was the FMLN in El Salvador. Of course, we know what came of all of that. We also know what came of anti-apartheid, like what the post-apartheid South Africa looks like. It's not what Nelson Mandela had in mind. So that was a kind of a late phenomenon of like trying to reconcile religion and politics. And it was in the context of the new right, the Christian right, that had seen the switching over from the New Deal coalition. So FDR's New Deal coalition had the evangelicals. The evangelicals were not with the Republicans, no. So that's part of the new right. The new right is when the evangelicals shift to the Republicans. And starting in the 60s, but really in the 70s and 80s. So there was this kind of vexed issue, a kind of a late kind of like Marxism, but really kind of Stalinism, trying to square the circle and seeing the solution in the 80s. A lot of people thought the solution was going to be liberation theology. Now, I mention this because, of course, when does Benjamin really hit? 80s, same time, right? So there's a specific context in which Benjamin's work sort of resonates from my generation, and for scholars writing in that generation, writing in the 80s, not our time. A very specific moment. Now there's also the deeper issue, since we're in Illuminations, that's what this text is published in, the Hannah Arendt and her curation of Benjamin, where she also tried to square, in some ways, the theological and the political in Benjamin, but not in a way that we might expect, because Arendt herself was not religious, and she was a kind of conservative liberal and a political theorist, and who really wanted to reconcile Benjamin with Heidegger. She didn't really want to reconcile Benjamin with religion, with traditional, like, Judaism. No, that was not Arendt's agenda at all. But she was interested in trying to reconcile Heidegger, who had been her teacher, and Benjamin. So there are some, like, 60s, so when Illuminations was first curated and published, the Arendt version in the United States, and then the 80s. So there's sort of two moments. But let's see what this looks like in the text itself. So there are two particular, but really peppered throughout, two particular strong images that we have from this essay that have been fundamentally misconstrued. The first is the automaton. The second is, of course, the angel of history. So we'll get to the angel of history. Let's start with the automaton. So the story is told of an automaton constructed in such a way that it can play a winning game of chess. By the way, this actually existed. Answering each move of an opponent with a counter move. A puppet in Turkish attire with a hookah in its mouth sat before a chessboard placed on a large table. A system of mirrors created the illusion that this table was transparent from all sides. Actually, a little hunchback who was an expert chess player sat inside and guided the puppet's hands by means of strings. One can imagine a philosophical counterpoint to this device. The puppet, called historical materialism, is to win all the time. It can easily be a match for anyone if it enlists the services of theology, which today, as we know, is wizened and has to keep out of sight. All right, well, first of all, historical materialism, meaning Marxism and Marxism. He's fighting over the meaning of Marxism. We've been dealing with this over the course of the semester. So he's arguing with and against other Marxists. There's a struggle over the meaning of Marxism in the 1920s and 30s, and specifically Stalinism, but also the deeper background, namely social democracy. So who says that they're winning all the time? Stalinists. Right. So for instance, on the eve of the Nazi seizure of power in Germany, the Communist Party says their slogan is, "After Hitler, us." Meaning, even if Hitler comes to power, it's just one more step in the progress of history. Right? So there's a faith in progress, there's an objective, the idea of an objective dynamic of history that is leading to freedom and progress, an automatic subject of history. That history is the succession of modes of production, and that happens regardless of what people think they're doing or their intentions. Benjamin's arguing against that, right? So the idea is that we're losing all the time, but actually we're winning, right? So Nazi seizure of power, Spanish Civil War, defeat of the Republic, spread of fascism throughout Europe, Stalinism in the Soviet Union, but we're winning. We're winning all the time. No, we're losing all the time. And that's why he invokes Rosa Luxemburg later, because Luxemburg wrote at the end of the German Revolution in 1919, it's her last writing, that the proletariat advances through defeats, but only if it has not unlearned how to learn. But only if it's not unlearned how to learn. So she sets up history as the defeat of 1848, the defeat of the Paris Commune, the defeat of the 1905 Russian Revolution. It's just one defeat after another, but it's okay. And she actually uses, she says, this is our road to Calvary. This is our Golgotha. Right? This is the cross that we have to carry. Right? So again, Luxembourg, Benjamin, they just use whatever. They use Christian, they use Jewish, they use whatever language. As long as we've not unlearned how to learn. And of course, that's the issue. Because we have unlearned how to learn. 2025, almost 2026, unlearned how to learn. Right. So people have read this as Benjamin advocating for Marxism using theology if it wants to win. That's how people have interpreted this. Scholars, PhDs, tenured faculty, the gatekeepers on critical theory have interpreted this the exact opposite of what Benjamin was saying.
So he is critiquing and listing theology for historical.
Yeah, it would be a trick. It would be a self-deception. It is the self-deception. In other words, Marxism is deceiving itself that it's advancing.
Because of the church?
Yes,
Okay.
that's right. Now, as it turns out, after Hitler also was true. Namely, the German communists came to power in East Germany after the defeat of the Nazis. I guess they were right. Right? But was that socialism? No. Okay. And not because I say so, but because clearly not. Clearly not. So, this is the issue. So historical materialism, and again, quote-unquote historical materialism. So he's disputing what historical materialism is and should be. He's disputing Marxism in order to try to advocate a kind of restoration of the original Marxism. That's really the whole point of this piece, as regards the philosophy of history. As regards the philosophy of history. So, what else do I want to say about this? Yes, so not winning all the time. The only way to turn losing all the time into winning all the time is a trick that you play theologically. God moves in mysterious ways. So you put the historical dynamic of progress in the place of God. So faith in progress, faith in God. Everything is happening for a reason. It's all according to God's plan. So the Marxists have put the Marxist theory in the place of a theology. Marxism has become theological, and that's bad. It's a self-deception. It's a trick. One of the most remarkable characteristics of human nature, writes Lotze, is alongside so much selfishness in specific instances, the freedom from envy, which the present displays towards the future. Reflection shows us that our image of happiness is thoroughly colored by the time in which the course of our own existence has assigned us. The kind of happiness that can arouse envy in us exists only in the air we have breathed, among people we could have talked to, women who could have given themselves to us. In other words, our image of happiness is indissolubly bound up with the image of redemption. The same applies to our view of the past, which is the concern of history. The past carries with it a temporal index by which it is referred to redemption. There is a secret agreement between past generations and the present one. Our coming was expected on earth. Like every generation that preceded us, we have been endowed with a weak messianic power, a power to which the past has a claim. That claim cannot be settled cheaply. Historical materialists are aware of that. So again, redemption, he leans very heavily on the kind of financial or monetary meaning of redemption, like he did in the Experience of Poverty piece, where he talked about us squandering our heritage for a fraction of its value at the pawn shop. Right, so this is the question, what are the terms of the redemption? Because capitalism does redeem the past, it does redeem history, but it does so cheaply, whereas the historical materialist understands that it cannot be settled cheaply. The demand for redemption cannot be settled cheaply. It is settled cheaply in capitalism. It can't be settled cheaply.
May I ask you to
Yeah.
elaborate on how capitalism cheaply redeems history?
Well, it accumulates, meaning past labor is translated into value in the present. So if capital is dead labor that dominates living labor, then the question is, what are the terms in which dead labor dominates living labor? And the terms are a fraction of its potential. Meaning, of course, we're not getting the full value of the sacrifices of the past. We're not. We're not getting the full value of past labor. No. In capitalism. Now, of course, will we ever? No, we won't. But the demand for redemption. So, the weak messianic power. Weak messianic power. So this is like the rhythm of messianic nature. Right? Insofar as nature redeems itself by renewing itself, it's through the eternal passing away. It's a kind of recycling of nature, the cycle of seasons. That's like the ancient conception. We're going to be talking about that also because I don't know if we've already mentioned that. Did we talk about the cycle and the linear? Cyclical and the linear? We may not have. Okay, so we have talked about how it's not past, present, future. But it is the interaction of the present and the past which generates possible futures. Now, another way of thinking about it is how to understand historical time. So what we have is a kind of contradiction. We have the linear, and then we have the cyclical. This is the cyclical. Now, the issue is how these are related. Right? So you could say that historical time is always linear and cyclical. So then the question is, how are these different aspects of historical time related? The linear aspect, in theological terms, I'll just make mention of this, is there's a beginning of time and an end of time. And then we're occupying this space or this line between the beginning and the end. And both the beginning and the end lie outside of historical time. So the Garden of Eden paradise is outside of historical time. It has no time. Again, Adam and Eve are immortal. So is everything in the Garden of Eden. The end of time. Right? That's one early kind of way of thinking of it. Again, the cycle of time, there's an ancient way of thinking about the cycle of time, and that's the renewal of the seasons. And then that's sort of enlarged. So the idea, like ancient philosophers have this idea that not only are things renewed sort of annually through the cycle of seasons, but also longue durée historical time has this cyclical pattern of renewal. Right, so we've always thought about historical time in both ways, and we still do. So the question is, what would be our models of linear and cyclical time in capitalism. So, meaning the ancient notion of linear time is not necessarily progressive. But our notion of linear time in modernity is progressive. And similarly, the ancients' notion of the cycle of time is not regressive, but when we think of the cycle of time, it is regressive. We think of regression, or as Benjamin puts it, retrogression. So, Benjamin, in this essay, we'll see, talks about progress of technology, the retrogression of society. So you have a contradiction there. Let me see what you posted on that.
Oh, it was just like, it's not necessarily related. It's
Oh,
just like
okay.
a documentary situation.
But is it about the actual thing, or no?
It's the Turkish.
Yeah.
It's in there, yeah.
Oh, okay, good. So that's a resource for us.
Yeah, just
Okay,
for fun.
cool. Yeah, because it is an actual thing. Absolutely. Right. All right, so let's step back a second after these first two theses. What is this text really about? So this is his historiographic introduction to the Arcades Project. Right, so if he had published his book, The Arcades Project, it would have been a work of history. It would have been like any historiographic work. It would have had a historian's introduction explaining the way he's doing history, explaining what his historiographical method is going to be. So every work of history begins with that kind of statement by the historian. So working on the Arcades Project, it was meant to be a work of history. It was meant to be an actual monograph on 19th century history. It was never realized. Right, so what we have now is not some kind of new way of writing or something. No, it's just note cards the way all historians ever researched and prepared to write a historical book. You keep note cards, and then you keep note cards and you sort them by folder on topics, and that's what we have. People have tried to turn this into some like new form of writing. It's not. It's an unwritten set of notes. No. Right, so we know from reading the Butler essays, he's capable of writing normal things, like making an argument, you know. Right, so anyway, now this is a strange historiographic introduction, definitely. I'm not going to claim that it's a traditional historian's introduction to a historical work. No, it is bizarre. It's aphoristic, but then again, Benjamin writes aphoristically. All right. That's why it was titled Theses on the Philosophy of History, even though the actual title is On the Concept of History, which is very different. So the problem with the title given to it erroneously, Theses on the Philosophy of History, is that it assumes that there is a philosophy of history, and that Benjamin just has his thoughts on the philosophy of history. Whereas, in fact, he's questioning things much more fundamentally. So on the concept of history, like what do we even mean by history at all, let alone philosophizing about it? Because again, philosophizing about history would assume what history is. And then having theses on the philosophy of history would assume what the philosophy of history is. He's not assuming either of those things. He's not assuming what history is or what the philosophy of history is.
do we know how this title for this song appeared?
I don't know, we can blame Hannah Arendt, I don't know.
Okay.
When in doubt. No, Hannah Arendt's fine. She's cool, and her writings are interesting. Did you guys see the movie? Did you see the movie? There's a movie about Hannah Arendt. It focuses on her coverage of the trial of Eichmann in Jerusalem, but it speaks to a lot more than that. And it also, the filmmaker is very great. Margareta von Trotta, she's a great filmmaker, and so the film is good. So I highly recommend the film.
So does our current generation have a weak messianic power because it's under capitalism, or does every generation have a weak messianic power because of the nature of time?
Good question. I mean, the way he puts it is, like every generation. And that's why we're kind of in the realm of that rhythm of messianic nature. Meaning, again, when we're thinking of cyclical time, we could just say, well, the generations renew, and so therefore, insofar as nature renews itself, it's endowed with a weak messianic power. Meaning, nature dies and it's resurrected. Like, in other words, where would we even get this idea of resurrection? We get it from observing nature. Right, so, again, there are ancient roots for the way we think about history. And that's important for us to consider because while there's a difference between modernity and the ancients, we're not always clear about what that difference is. And everything that we have for making sense of the present comes from the past. It comes from the deep past. We talked about this with respect to language. Language is an ancient tool that we have to use in a very peculiar way to describe our condition now. And whenever we describe our condition now, what we're doing is translating it into ancient terms. But that doesn't mean that we actually are still ancients. No. Right, language, art, everything is ancient. Historiography is ancient. If you recall from last time, we looked at the introduction to the 1939 version of the Paris Expose, and he says you should compare Herodotus to the morning newspaper, and then the vertigo that you have from that sense, you get from that comparison, will give you an indication of our situation. So Herodotus, an ancient historian, versus the modern newspaper. Now, there's a lot packed into these ideas. Let me just say something, because Hegel's in the background of all of this. And again, one of the ways that Benjamin has been misconstrued is as an alternative to Hegel, as somehow he's attacking Hegel's philosophy of history, or even that because he's Nietzschean, he must be opposed to or disagreeing with Hegel's philosophy. No, because Nietzsche didn't either. Nietzsche didn't either. So, not at all. Now, what did Hegel say about history? He said that there are three kinds of history, and they developed historically. So there's a history of history. The first kind of history is chronicling. It's journalism. It's writing the record of the present that in the future will become the record of the past. But we're writing it as the present. The second kind of history is retrospective history, meaning when you're writing about the past. When you're writing from the standpoint of the present about the past, where you're not writing about the present and leaving a record that future people will treat as the record of the past. You're looking at the record of the past, and you're making sense of it in the present. And of course, that's what we really mean by history. So history, again, is not the past. It's not the past. So what is it? It's the relation of the present and the past. And that relation between the present and the past is bidirectional. It's not unidirectional. Right, so when we say history, we don't mean the past, we mean how we relate to it. And again, the Faulkner, always keep the Faulkner quotation at the ready. The past is not dead, it's not even past. The past is not dead, it's not even past, because after all, everything that exists, including ourselves, our biological, physical selves, it's the past. It's the persistence of the past. Matter is the sustained action of the past, according to Parasol. Matter itself is the sustained action of the past.
Chris, hi.
Yeah,
I
go
have
ahead.
a question.
Uh-huh.
Sorry.
Yeah.
So when you were saying that we inherit, well, as you have been saying with all of this idea of the past and how we've inherited everything from the ancients, how is this different from the romantic relationship to the past? Because I know this is like opposed to the romantics. So
It's not.
Where do we draw the line between like
it's trying to
looking at the
take.
past as redemption and looking at the past with nostalgia?
Well, you wouldn't be able to separate those entirely. In other words, like Hegel is in critical dialogue with the Romantics for sure, and so is Benjamin. However, it doesn't dismiss Romanticism. In other words, what it does is it tries to interpret Romanticism better than Romanticism understands itself. So if Romanticism understands itself in this kind of melancholic, nostalgic way, then Hegel is there to say, because after all, Hölderlin, who's the arch-romantic, the total romantic, was his college roommate. Yes? So this is like a live issue for Hegel. What is the truth of Romanticism, even if Romanticism misconceives or misconstrues its own truth? But yet, what is the truth of it? And I think we've talked about this. The Romantic is not equivalent to counter-enlightenment, but is related to counter-enlightenment. I think that I might have also mentioned Gadamer. He's another student of Heidegger who writes about hermeneutics, that Romanticism should not be understood as the antithesis to Enlightenment, but as its continuation. Okay, so there isn't a line to be drawn, because again, we would assume, wrongly again, that the Enlightenment had a progressive view of history, and that Marxism inherits this like naive belief in progress from the Enlightenment, and that Romanticism is there to sound a note of objection and dissent and say, oh no, history is not progress. History is also decline and regression and decay, and look at how far we've fallen from the ancients and the medievals and even the bourgeois, the Renaissance. Look at how far we've fallen from the classics. Right? So it isn't, because remember with Hegel, it's dialectical. It's dialectical, which means that it's not a flat opposition. It's not an either or. It's not. Meaning it's both. It's both, but it's also neither in the sense that you can't take either of the self-conceptions. Now, insofar as the Enlightenment had some kind of progressive view of history, it actually didn't. The Enlightenment is more complicated than that. But insofar as they did, there's a truth to it. Insofar as the Romantics are more in touch with loss, historical loss, there's a truth to that. There is. Right? So again, these shouldn't be hypostasized. And when we think about progress and gain and loss, historical advance, historical gain versus historical loss, what are we using? We're using quantitative measurements. What if it's a qualitative change, not a quantitative change? Right? What if it's not an increase or a decrease, but a qualitative transformation, a difference? So Romanticism does give us a sense of historical difference, not just a quantitative comparison. Increase, decrease. Right, so that's one thing that should alert us to begin with, is what do we mean? And can you have qualitative transformations that nonetheless are progress? That's Hegel's difficulty. Is that Hegel actually wants us to say, to be able to say, wants us to be able to think that there are qualitative transformations, apples and oranges, difference, that are nonetheless progressive. And that's why he says it's progress in consciousness of freedom. It's not progress in happiness, no. In fact, because Rousseau taught him that, our progress in freedom might make us more unhappy. It's not progress in happiness. Now, by the way, Nietzsche would be seen as, especially the early Nietzsche, the more romantic Nietzsche, as a kind of foe of progress. But really, Nietzsche's point is transvaluation of values, meaning, and his objection to especially right-wing Hegelianism is that it reconciles contradiction. It sort of ratifies things that have happened historically as a kind of naive theology. You know, God's will is working itself out through history. That's not what Hegel thought. That's not what Hegel thought. Hegel thought freedom is working itself out in history, but freedom's not God. God is an alienated image of freedom for Hegel. Meaning we used to attribute our freedom to the gods, but now we know that it's our own. Again, all of this is a given for Benjamin. Given. He's not questioning any of this. 20th century, in a way, hasn't happened yet for Benjamin. No, really. Right? Like looking at, I don't know, Nazism, well, obviously the purges, the Holocaust, the nuclear war at the end of World War II, Korea, Vietnam, all the civil wars in the post-colonial world, millions and millions and millions, the hecatomb of the 20th century, right? Was that all progress in consciousness of freedom? No. No, but then again, Hegel never claimed any such thing. Right? A lot can happen without it being progress in consciousness of freedom. A lot can happen without history. In other words, without progress in our relation to the past. And again, that relation, you should always keep in mind that the relation idea is really an active one, meaning our relation is meant an interaction. So history tells us how we're interacting with the past and the present. So past action continues, but nonetheless, we have our own action. And when we act, we're necessarily interacting with what exists, which means that we're interacting with the action of the past. That's why we need these different ways of conceiving of historical time.
Apologies, we were talking about 3 kinds of history, and maybe I
Oh, we didn't get to the third.
Research,
The
yeah.
third is philosophical history.
Yeah.
Philosophical history. And that philosophical history is about progress in consciousness of freedom, which the critical historian, the retrospective historian, is not necessarily concerned with, and the chronicler is not concerned with, or the journalist is not concerned with. Right. So philosophical history, it actually builds off a Kantian essay. Kant's essay, the idea for a universal history from the cosmopolitan point of view, which I think we looked at. Yeah, we looked at how it's peculiar that people are building in their generation a house that they will never be able to live in, that will be lived in by subsequent generations. Right. Again, the labor of the past and the sacrifice of the past. The sacrifice of the past.
Is that what he means, that the past has acclaimed our weak messianic power?
Oh, sure. Exactly. In other words, it has to have been for something. Right? Our coming was expected on earth. That's right. Meaning, the past wants us to redeem it. The past sacrifice, the past suffering does want us to redeem it. It is tasking us with redeeming it. Are we? Or are we in this romantic melancholy? Like just spellbound by the awful sacrifice and suffering of the past. And we can never make up for all these bad things that have happened. Well, of course we can't. Only God can. And God's not our concern. What is our concern? Politics. Benjamin is a Marxist. This is written for political purpose. Again, intervention in Marxism. Saying, comrades, really? Faith in progress? Really? We're winning, comrades? Really? If each aphorism began comrades, it does. It does. To such an extent, it doesn't have to be said. Now, that's another problem, by the way. So we're not Marxists, and we're reading this. It's kind of like, okay, so we just do this kind of cargo cult kind of interpretation. You know, we just pick up this weird artifact, Walter Benjamin, and it's kind of like, okay, what does this mean? Okay, so let's get to the third one. Chronicler who recites events without distinguishing between major and minor ones acts in accordance with the following truth. Nothing that has ever happened should be regarded as lost for history. To be sure, only a redeemed mankind receives the fullness of its past, which is to say, only for a redeemed mankind has its past become citable in all of its moments. Each moment it has lived becomes a citation of the order of the day, and that day is Judgment Day. Okay, so let's unpack that. So if we recall Nietzsche, the use and abuse of history for life, antiquarian history. Antiquarian history, everything, we are unable to distinguish between minor and major. Historicism. Historicism is antiquarian history. So he's going to use the term historicism. That's antiquarian history. And it's the 19th century version of history that's kind of lost because it doesn't know what its values are. And so it tries to be objective, it tries to be empirical and factual, it tries to cite everything and amass everything into the archive. That's the work of capitalism, the attempt to sort of accumulate all value. Now, as it turns out, it's fallacious, it's kind of futile. And so he's saying, nothing is lost for history. There is a truth to this inability to distinguish between major and minor. But that truth is not really about us now. It's about the demand for redemption. So what we're going to see is that Benjamin is accepting that he's living in that moment of antiquarian history and historicism that Nietzsche diagnosed. And that is the product of history as a romantic discipline. You know, these 19th century disciplines like anthropology, archaeology, philology, but history itself. So we looked at the Peter Proust where he said that the 19th century had discovered history, right? So, but again, it is a reified discovery. It is historicism. That's important because why would it be the 19th century that discovered history? Of course, people had written past retrospective histories prior to the 19th century. The 19th century was the attempt to be scientific about it. And it started out with Hegelian scientific philosophy, and it ended up with historicism. And so scientific history in the Hegelian sense is the Wissenschaft, again, the philosophical science.
Pablo has a question.
Yeah, go ahead, Pablo.
Yeah, is this notion of time the same as Bergson's? Like time is not antiquarian in the sense that we have like accumulated separate facts, but like a duration, like the durée? Is it the same thing?
That's what redemption would suggest. In other words, it suggests the continued action in the past that we can interact with and we can realize its potential and its value. So yes, in that sense. Although we would also have to, because Benjamin's critical of Bergson, meaning Bergson is a symptom. It's a symptom of capitalism. Bergsonian philosophy is a symptom of capitalism. So this desire to replace episodic time with durational time is itself a symptom. Meaning that contradiction between the two kinds of time is what would need to be grasped or comprehended. So for Bergson, durée is like the solution, not for Benjamin. Like for Benjamin, it's rather the contradiction between the two kinds of time that must be engaged. Right. So I will say this also about, let's say, this is like, is it cumulative? Is that what we mean by linear time? And whereas cyclical time would appear to be like reiterative, but also it would make it seem like, okay, let's, so we have the past is not dead, it's not even past. We also have history is bunk. That's Henry Ford. History is bunk. And also, and I'm forgetting who says this. I don't know if it's Winston Churchill. One damn thing after another. So is history one damn thing after another? Well, of course it is. One damn thing after another. And it's also bunk in the sense that it's just accumulated debris. We'll see with the angel of history. It's just garbage. It's just the accumulation is just an accumulation of garbage, wreckage, debris. Now, of course, Henry Ford and even Winston Churchill would be more like destructive character types. They'd be more like the will to the tabula rasa. They'd be more like the positive concept of barbarism, right? So when you're being overwhelmed by the trash of the past, then you just need to clear it and wipe the slate clean and try to build up on the basis of the minimal amount of resources. That's the positive concept of barbarism. But again, it's not about endorsing that. It's about where does that come from? Because the will to the tabula rasa is a modern thing. This is not how people regarded the legacy of the past. They didn't regard it as an oppressive weight that they need to overthrow. I'll say one more thing, because I mentioned God already. Do we need to annihilate the past to be free in the present? Meaning, do we have to negate it? Do we have to negate the past? No. No. It can look like that. It can look like negation of the past is required for freedom in the present. But that's not really possible, since in a sense everything is the past, including ourselves. It's also not necessary. Now, why is that important? Because we're going to get to the revolutionaries restarting the calendar and shooting the clocks, stopping time, restarting the calendar, right? And the tension between those, the tension between 1789 and 1830. So 1789, what do? They restart the calendar. They say, Christianity, no. Year one of the Republic. And they create a new calendar. 1830, they shoot the clocks. And we'll see that Benjamin thinks that there's a difference between restarting the calendar and shooting the clocks. So the difference would be capitalism. Meaning already in 1830, the Industrial Revolution is registering capitalism, and it's giving people not a desire to restart historical time in a sense of the calendar, but rather stopping time in terms of the clock. Stopping the clock. The Jacobins, the revolution of that time, I will also say Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson said, the past has no claim on us, the world belongs to the living. The world belongs to the living, not to the dead. Cool, that sounds great. That isn't entirely true. And what about in capitalism? Especially if Marx says we're dominated by the past. Dead labor dominates living labor, then the desire that Jefferson has is all well and good, but it's not going to be just like that.
So redeeming the past is a different activity than negating the past.
Yes,
Okay.
absolutely. Okay, yes. To bring it home. To bring it home. Absolutely. No, I appreciate that because indeed that is the point. The point is that we don't need to negate the past, but we might need to redeem it. And then the question is, what does that mean? What is redeeming the past? Because that's what's being posed. In other words, Benjamin, in writing the Arcades Project, what is he trying to do with this? Well, he's trying to read history against the grain. We'll get to that. He's trying to approach history critically, but in a way that perhaps is different from Nietzsche. We'll get to that. It's not that writing the Arcades Project is going to redeem the 19th century. It's not. That in and of itself is not going to redeem it. The only thing that can redeem the 19th century is socialism. So no writing by Benjamin is going to do that. Right? Nonetheless, what would writing the history of the 19th century under the task of redemption look like? What would be the attitude towards the past that one would take if one accepts that the present is tasked with redeeming the past? But the historiographic work itself won't do it. Hegel didn't think so either. In other words, when Hegel said history is, in the philosophical sense, history is progress of consciousness and freedom, it isn't meant to be like a magical, like waving a wand and, oh, Hegel said it and therefore it, makes it so. No. Right, it's the task under which the philosopher of history has to approach the past. Right, but that doesn't mean that it is actually doing it. It doesn't mean that like Hegel is progressing consciousness and freedom himself, like his philosophy did. Neither is Benjamin's writings. So it's not that he's saying, this is how I'm going to redeem the past. No, he's saying, this is how I'm approaching the past, aware of the fact that we're tasked with redeeming it. We're not approaching it neutrally. We're not approaching it as a neutral set of facts or as objective. Remember what Peter Proust said in the intro to Nietzsche. He said, if we treat it in the historicist sense as a objective activity of just accumulating the facts of the past, that's the perversion of history. It's a perversion of history that is not how humanity is a historical being. That's a perversion, it's a violation of how we're a historical being. Who did I cite? Oh, Ortega y Gasset. Right? That what nature is for animals, history is for humans. Meaning, animals have their natural existence that they use to live. We need history to live. We can't just rely on our innate nature. No, we need history. We're historical beings. Right, so nature determines what animals do. History determines what we do. Tasks us.
Chris, I have another question. So, where does science fit in here? So, if approaching history neutrally or objectively, like historicism, which is like scientific, then history is
Supposedly.
only philosophical, then where does subjectivity exist? It doesn't exist at all for Benjamin. Like, what's his position towards the science of history?
Of course subjectivity exists for Benjamin. Absolutely. In other words,
Objectivity.
oh, objectivity. Okay. Well, objectivity is never without subjectivity. Meaning he does agree with two things. He agrees with the Wissenschaft notion of science. That's knowledge aware of its own conditions of possibility. It's Kant, Hegel. It's the reality of the subject. But the object is what it is for the subject. It's not outside of it. He also agrees with Nietzsche, however, that scientific objectivity has become an abdication of subjectivity. In other words, that subjectivity is being asserted, but is hiding behind objectivity. Right, there is a will to power being expressed, but it's wearing the mask of the facts.
Okay, but can history be scientific? Like a mix of history, archaeology, anthropology. Like how would Benjamin stand and do this? Like in face of this?
Well, okay. Again, I'll make reference to Kant and Hegel, which is that they said that, of course, philosophical history doesn't negate primary history. Meaning, of course, you need to know the facts, but you can't leave it at the facts.
Sure.
Because if you leave it at the facts, what you're doing is smuggling in subjectivity that's not acknowledged. You're treating subjectivity as ready-made. So that's the point. Like, I think at the end of Kant's essay on idea for universal history from a cosmopolitan point of view, he says nothing that I've written here should be misconstrued as saying that the philosopher can substitute themselves for the historian. So you guys have heard the accusation of presentism. Have you heard presentism? Like, oh, presentism is bad, right? No, this is presentism. Of course, Benjamin's presentist, Hegel's presentist, Kant's presentist. Meaning this whole like anti-presentism is itself the problem. Because we are presentists. The only question is how. So if we pretend we're not being presentist, it doesn't mean that we're not being presentist. We are, but we're deceiving ourselves about it. Yeah.
And with this model, the linear and cyclical, where would you place us in those models? Like, are we part of the linear line, or do we sit outside of the line? And like cyclical as well, are we in the core of that?
Okay, so the question is, how are these related?
More so like, are we at the core of the cyclical model and history is spinning around us, or are we spinning in history?
Where's the
I'm
you are
tempted-
here on the diagram?
Where's the what?
The you are here on the diagram.
Oh, okay, so we have two diagrams, right? So actually there's another diagram. I'm thinking of when we should have done this. We should have done this already, but maybe we haven't. Which is, this is hard to visualize because it's going to be misleading no matter what we do. Because we're actually talking about something that's not two-dimensional in either respect. So neither a circle nor a line. Now the language that was used by Lenin was spiral. Spiral of history, okay? Right, so that would be, that would be some kind of, like, yeah, we're kind of advancing, right? The spiral of history, that's tricky too, though. Meaning that we are, like, going up and up, but we're also circling around and around. That can also be problematic. You can imagine how that's going to be used as well. Although Lenin attributed it to Hegel, the spiral of history. What's the passage from Lenin? Of course, Lenin is very dear to poor Benjamin. encyclopedia entry on Karl Marx. Let's see. This is the section. Oh yeah, here we go. Here's Lenin. In our times, the idea of development, of evolution, has almost completely penetrated social consciousness only in other ways, and not through Hegelian philosophy. Still, this idea is formulated by Marx and Engels on the basis of Hegel's philosophy. It's far more comprehensive and far richer in content than the current idea of evolution is. A development that repeats, as it were, stages that have already been passed, but repeats them in a different way, on a higher basis, the negation of a negation. A development, so to speak, that proceeds in spirals, not in a straight line. A development by leaps, catastrophes, and revolutions, breaks in continuity, the transformation of quantity into quality, inner impulses towards development imparted by the contradiction and conflict of various forces and tendencies acting on a given body, or within a given phenomenon, or within a given society, the interdependence and the closest and indissoluble connection of all aspects of any phenomenon, history constantly revealing ever new aspects. Connection that provides a uniform and universal process of motion, one that follows definite laws. These are some of the features of dialectics as a doctrine of development that is richer than the conventional one. And then he says, see, for example, or compare Marx's letter to Engels, in which he ridicules Stein's wooden trichotomies, which it would be absurd to confuse with materialist dialectics. So what are the wooden trichotomies? That's the thesis, antithesis, synthesis. So that's not Hegel. It's Fichte, it's not Hegel. So again, like with these kinds of things, with Marxism especially, but even with Hegel, whatever you've heard is wrong. Sorry, children. Yeah, so that's Lenin. Now, so where are we? Okay, so that's the Lenin spiral. I'll offer another one. I'll offer a different one. You ready? This is like,
Range. Spirals.
it's I don't know. It's not fractals. It's not fractals. Because fractals is about the micro and the macro. It's more about how each moment of the past has a potential that was not fulfilled in the further advance of historical time. So it's about how each moment can appear to be a kind of cul-de-sac or dead end that seems to be sealed away from the progress of history. Right, so each of these moments of unfulfilled potential would demand redemption. Now, what Lenin says is important, though, right? So, history constantly revealing ever new aspects. That's a very Hegelian idea. Meaning, Hegel thinks that what the past was changes as a function of the present. So, as the present changes, then new things in the past are revealed in their significance. Right, so Hegel infamously said there are times and places, there are peoples without history. What? There are blank pages of history. But that's not a done deal, meaning in the future, suddenly something that didn't seem to have history suddenly will have history, meaning will appear to be part of the story of the progress and consciousness of freedom. So from the standpoint of the present, not everything in the past seems to be about the task of freedom that we have now. But that doesn't mean it's a closed book. Right? The past can always have a changed significance. But we do have to accept the significance that it has now as tasking us. In other words, when history flashes up, to use Benjamin's language, it's flashing up in a moment of danger because it's tasking us, because it's telling us, oh, see, This thing happened in the past that we're suddenly reminded of now. And that's because we're being told what we have to do now. But that changes. That's why the past is also not dead, meaning the past is still active and alive, meaning it can yield further meaning and potential. And that's why we might, again, be accumulating all this past data. Again, unconsciously we're doing it because we don't know what it might mean. But in reality, it could be that because we're taking all this stuff whose potential has yet to be realized. Right, so the problem with historicism is when we accept, like to use Nietzsche's language, when we accept the status of the epigony, where we basically we drown in the dust of bibliographic quizquilia because we have a sense of our own lateness. So we have this sense of like everything that ever happened in the past and nothing's happening now. And so all we can do is subordinate ourselves to the past. That's what Nietzsche objected to. And that's what Benjamin might object to in terms of historicism, is that it leaves aside the question of what we're doing with history now. And that's where's the mask of scientific objectivity. You know, the researcher. Right, so, I mean, I can tell you as an academic, what am I supposed to do? To publish an academic article, what am I supposed to do? I'm supposed to be taking knowledge that I've accumulated in the archive and make it available to others. And make a case for why it's important. But ultimately, the case that I make for why it's important, people can agree or disagree with it. What's most important is that I am digesting the archive for them, so that they can go, you know, we're sort of curating the archive so that they can go and do something else with the archive, right? So I'm supposed to be producing basically neutral knowledge production. And what Benjamin is saying is that, yeah, but there is no such neutral, objective knowledge production. Meaning that kind of neutral, objective knowledge production is just production for the status quo, for the needs of the status quo, or for the ruling class, for the ruling powers. The heliotrope is good. Here's Hegel: seek for food and clothing first, and the kingdom of God shall be added unto you. The class struggle, which is always present to a historian influenced by Marx, is a fight for the crude and material things without which no refined and spiritual things could exist. Nevertheless, it is not in the form of the spoils which fall to the victor that the latter make their presence felt in the class struggle. They manifest themselves in this struggle as courage, humor, cunning, and fortitude. They have retroactive force and will constantly call in question every victory, past and present, of the rulers. As flowers turn towards the sun by dint of a secret heliotropism, the past strives to turn towards that sun which is rising in the sky of history. The historical materialist must be aware of this most inconspicuous of all transformations. So again, that would be the weak messianic power, or the history against the grain, right? Sort of the countervailing. The true picture of the past flits by. The past can be seized only as an image which flashes up at the instant when it can be recognized and is never seen again. The truth will not run away from us. In the historical outlook of historicism, these words of Gottfried Keller mark the exact point where historical materialism cuts through historicism. For every image of the past that is not recognized by the present as one of its own concerns threatens to disappear irretrievably. The good tidings which the historian of the past brings with throbbing heart may be lost in a void the very moment he opens his mouth. To articulate the past historically does not mean to recognize it the way it really was. And that's Ranke. who is an example of historicism that Lukács uses in History and Class Consciousness, of reified history. It means to seize hold of a memory as it flashes up at a moment of danger. So not to recognize as it really was, but rather a memory as it flashes up in a moment of danger. Historical materialism wishes to retain that image of the past, which unexpectedly appears to man singled out by history at a moment of danger. The danger affects both the content of the tradition and its receivers. The same threat hangs over both, that of becoming a tool of the ruling classes. In every era, the attempt must be made anew to wrest tradition away from a conformism that is about to overpower it. The Messiah comes not only as the Redeemer, he comes as the subduer of the Antichrist. Only that historian will have the gift of fanning the spark of hope in the past, who is firmly convinced that even the dead will not be saved from the enemy if he wins, and this enemy has not ceased to be victorious. So even the dead are not safe, meaning Benny means not safe. If you want to know where my animus comes from, that's where it comes from. Men are not safe, Benjamin is not safe, Berlin is not safe. Consider the darkness and the great cold in this veil which resounds with mystery. Brecht, the Three-Penny Opera. To historians who wish to relive an era, Fustel Duclange recommends that they blot out everything that they know about the later course of history. There is no better way of characterizing the method with which historical materialism has broken. Right? So not the past as it actually was, and not the past isolated from later development. No. It is a process of empathy whose origin is the indolence of the heart, acedia, which despairs of grasping and holding the genuine historical image as it flares up briefly. Among medieval theologians, it was regarded as the root cause of sadness. Flaubert, who was familiar with it, wrote, "How sad you'd have to be to want to resurrect Carthage." And we talked about this in the Nietzsche piece. So why would they want to resurrect Carthage? Because bourgeois society sees history differently. It no longer identifies with the Roman Empire or with medieval Christendom. Right? Bourgeois society says, actually, it would have been better if Carthage had won against Rome, because then we could have had our commercial society and not a society of conquest and militarism, feudalism. The nature of this sadness stands out more clearly if one asks with whom the adherents of historicism actually empathize. The answer is inevitable, with the victor. And all rulers are the heirs of those who conquered before them. Hence, empathy with the victor invariably benefits the rulers. Historical materialists know what that means. Whoever has emerged victorious participates to this day in the triumphal procession in which the present rulers step over those who are lying prostrate. According to traditional practice, the spoils are carried along in a procession. They are called cultural treasures, and historical materialists views them with cautious detachment. For with that exception, the cultural treasures he surveys have an origin which he cannot contemplate without horror. They owe their existence not only to the efforts of the great minds and talents who have created them, but also to the anonymous toil of their contemporaries. There is no document of civilization which is not at the same time a document of barbarism. And just as such a document is not free of barbarism, barbarism taints also the manner in which it was transmitted from one owner to another. A historical materialist therefore dissociates himself as far from it as possible. He regards it as his task to brush history against the grain. Right, so the way the past is coming to us is itself a problem. Right, so the continued action of the past in capitalism is the continued action of the past in capitalism. Right, so we can't simply accept it as it comes to us, or as it already acts. The tradition of the oppressed teaches us that the state of emergency in which we live is not the exception but the rule. So ever since 1848. the state has been acting in a state of emergency. That's Louis Bonaparte. We must attain to a conception of history that is in keeping with this insight. Then we shall clearly realize that it is our task to bring about a real state of emergency. And this will improve our position in the struggle against fascism, since fascism plays on the state of emergency. One reason why fascism has a chance is that in the name of progress, its opponents treat it as a historical norm. It's a very strange passage. I looked at the German, meaning we naturalize fascism. The current amazement that the things we are experiencing are still possible in the 20th century is not philosophical. This amazement is not the beginning of knowledge unless it is the knowledge that the view of history which gives rise to it is untenable. Are we doing that still, children?
Just replace 20s with
21st century,
Yeah.
right? So people are like, my God, a genocide is happening in real time.
2025.
What were you doing during the genocide? You have to answer that question the way people had to answer the question what they were doing when Hitler was in power. And it's like, okay, I guess, but wait, that's because the young people are shocked that these things are still happening. They should not be. There's no reason why these things will not continue to happen. They've always continued to happen. They will continue to happen. Right, so the view of history that assumes that we're past all that, no, we're not past all of it. In fact, the worst is probably yet to come. All right, let's take a break and then we'll come back on the Angelus Novus. I meant to.
Oh, okay, sure. Wrong tool.
Yeah, exactly. Like, I mean, look, the characterization of world politics method of nihilism is not exactly like celebratory,
Sure.
right?
Yeah.
So it's kind of like, I mean, look, actually, I'm very much a fan of the idea that Marxism seeks to overcome the need for politics, right? Like we quoted Lenin, so Lenin, like the goal is to abolish the state, to get rid of the necessity of the state, and that also means getting rid of the necessity of politics. Meaning the only politics that's still required is the class struggle. And obviously that's not meant to be forever. That's meant to be done, over, right? So in other words, whatever we have to do politically now, we shouldn't make a virtue of necessity. And we should understand that the goal is to overcome that necessity. Right, so it's not like, it's not like some celebration. Because you know who did celebrate politics was Carl Schmitt, who's the contemporary of Benjamin. He writes the Critique of Violence, that I think we have in Reflections, the Critique of Violence against Carl Schmitt, where Carl Schmitt has this idea that like politics is what makes us human, and Benjamin's like, hell's no.
That would be.
Yeah, although it's plausible, right?
Yeah.
So because Carl Schmitt's like the pro-Nazi, like he's the legal Nazi who comes up with the rationale for the state of emergency, actually, when the Nazis take power. And so his Carl Schmitt's point is liberalism dehumanizes us by trying to put commerce and entertainment above politics. And it's kind of like, actually, if we just had commerce and entertainment and no politics, that would be fun.
Sounds great.
It sounds great, right? But anyway, so he's just like, the liberals like dehumanize all political opposition, right? All fundamental political opposition. And there's like a little bit of a point to this. And unfortunately, the left has embraced Carl Schmitt. Because they're like, oh, yes, this is like why the liberals like always... Personal is political for sure. Everything is political, but also like liberalism treats all political opposition as terrorism, which is also true. You know, they call Trump and his followers terrorists, right? January 6th, right? So it's kind of true, but the answer isn't like to ontologize politics, which is what Schmitt does, and a lot of people actually, than are just like, the way to reclaim our humanity is through like politics. And it's kind of like, not exactly.
So, just like another clarifying, the only thing that can happen, the reason why we have weak messianic power is because the only real messianic, strong messianic is the Messiah, which ends history.
Right.
Correct?
Right.
Okay. Like the cycle stopped when the Messiah comes.
Yeah.
And do you feel like Benjamin is genuine in the religious, like the literal religious belief in the Messiah, or do you?
No.
Okay, it's allegorical.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it's not an allegory that's mapped onto the class stream, is it? Because he seems like he's arguing against that. That like we shouldn't
Right.
have this like blending of the class struggle was God or the other.
Okay, so the point would be that we should understand how and why we might be theological in our approach to history and
Okay.
politics,
Sure.
right? Rather than just sort of spontaneously, like naively, naturalizingly do so, right? So we should not take that for granted. We have to understand where it's coming from, what the problem with it is.
That makes like he's trying to extricate these two threads that have become very intertwined.
And confused, yeah.
The dialogue is.
Yeah, because if you remember from the Surrealism essay, he said, so what does this mean, theological politics? No, right? He says in the Surrealism essay, anything but that, no, right? Even though at the same time he says that maybe religion is more like surrealist than narcotics, right?
It's also because at the start, in the first thesis, he uses historic materialistic quotes.
And then
he seems to be adopting that label for what he's doing.
because he's opposing his version versus the existing version. Yeah.
Semantics.
It is a little bit, yeah.
Everyone else is doing the wrong historical materialism, right?
And he might have a claim to that.
Yeah, it is hard. I mean, I feel like my first Marx theory class I took, it started what you said, where it's just like anytime you read any of this, it's like hearing one side of a phone call or something. It's like just reading this and I thought the conversations with Brecht was really interesting. Just on
Oh, yeah.
a biographical note of understanding, just on a sociological level, the degree that they were. Brecht was worried about what people in Russia were thinking about what he wrote. They were involved in this very intensive continental
Small world.
politics. Yeah.
Definitely small
It's
world.
picking this up, it's so easy to be oh, it's just nice poetry, and it's no, they were in
There's stakes.
the trenches.
I mean, not only, it's worse than that, because, the Communist International was headquartered in Moscow. And so they would summon members of communist parties around the world to Moscow, and they would often put them in jail or kill them. They would.
No, I mean, yeah.
Right, and they would respond. They would go, they would get the summons by telegram, and they'd be like, okay, I guess I got to go to Moscow. And they knew that something bad might happen, but they went anyway, because they were under discipline and they understood, And Stalinism definitely played up the idea, the military metaphor, that the party and the international was like an army, and so every member of the party is basically like a soldier, and so you might be asked to sacrifice yourself, or if you do the wrong thing, you might be put to death for doing the wrong thing. They accepted that that was the case. In a way that's hard for us to quite imagine, but but there's a point to that. But it was abused.
Well, even being meta with it now is it at all important for us to think about or try to reconstruct the context in which Benjamin wrote this, or do we just have his stamp of approval to run wild with whatever we're drawing from this,
I mean,
in 2025?
We don't have that, not to run wild, because he doesn't sanction that. But, and maybe we should save this kind of discussion for when class is back, but what would it mean to read Marxism against the grain? The history of Marxism against the grain. Because of course that's what he's doing. Like when he's arguing against like Joseph Dietzken and right, social democracy, like that was like the dominant, that was the official Marxism. So he's reading the history of Marxism against the grain, and he's making reference to people like Rosa Luxemburg to do that. Who was put to death by the Social Democrats, basically, right? So that's, and also the assumption there being that somehow the history of Marxism is some kind of like crystallized essence of the history of the whole modern era, which is of course what they thought. It's what Marxists have always thought. They always thought that everything was just a function of like the class struggle, the revolution, and therefore the disputes within their own movement were like the world historic disputes.
Sure.
Like they were the decisive disputes, not whatever was going on in capitalist politics. Yeah, I mean, again, it's fanciful to us now, but back then they might have had more of a plausible claim to that. Yes, they do. They do, and that's why the left like fights against itself to the degree that it does.
Do you think he would have been called to Moscow and that?
Okay, so here's the difference. So Brecht is a card-carrying Communist Party member, Benjamin's not. So the thing about being in the Communist Party is that you sign up for it. Meaning it's like you accept this discipline. So no, Benjamin never did, of course, because Benjamin was like, yeah, no, I don't think so, right? Like I don't think that I'm going to be able to function that way. And of course, in the time period that he was, active, it became clear that, what was needed was a critique of what was going on in the Marxist movement, and that maybe you wouldn't be able to do that if you were a card-carrying party member. So Lukács turned against his own work.
Like theory of the novel.
Well, certainly that, but history and class
He
consciousness.
turned against that.
He turned against that. Yeah, because the officials were like, yeah, comrade, that's not good. And so he's like, okay, I guess I was wrong. And then he condemns the Frankfurt School for following that. Right. Korsch, who was mentioned in the conversations with Brecht, so he takes the other tack. So he ends up in disagreement with the official communists, but then he decides to quit. So he becomes like an anarchist instead, right? So that's the other thing. And that's why Brecht chose him as a mentor, because he wanted a heterodox teacher in Marxism. And why they do make some ironical comments about Lukács in that conversation with Brecht too, don't they?
Yeah.
Yeah, because they're just like, yeah, Lukács has like is like duplicitous, is like pretending to go along, even though he might not really be going along. All right, let's resume. All right, so we're up to the Angelus Novus. Yeah.
Chris, hi. Before you go on with that, could you please clarify what Benjamin meant by the figure of the automaton? This is not very clear to me. Like the automaton and the weak messianic power, those two things, like what do they exactly do they mean?
Well, the automaton is the carnival trick that Marxism has become, meaning it's a fraud, right? So there is no automatic progress of history, right? So it's just an image that's meant to show the folly of Marxism adopting a undigested and unacknowledged theological, like inner core of faith in progress that is wrong, right? So that's the automaton. Now the weak messianic power is a little bit more difficult, right? So again, we talked about it in terms of how nature itself is messianic by virtue of its eternal passing away. Right, so there's that kind of notion of redemption. Now, by the way, we also have, from earlier in the course, we have Kafka. We have the end of Josephine the Singer, where he says, Josephine will rise to the heights of redemption like all her brothers by being forgotten. Right, so nature's eternal passing away, one could say that maybe that's the redemption. That's the only redemption that's open to us, is that our happiness, our unhappiness passes away.
Like Solomonic, everything passes and that shall pass.
Right, right. So it's, I would say that the weak messianic power is, it's different from the demand for redemption that he's talking about, right? So he's talking about writing history under the demand for redemption. You know, it's under that task. How does history look when one accepts that demand for redemption? And he's distinguishing that from historicism. So by distinguishing it from historicism, he's saying it's not the past as it actually was, nor is it the past imagined without regard to the future course of events. Now, why was it not the past as it actually was, nor separated out from history, from the further events? Because that would be to accept things simply as they were rather than how they could have been. So there is one way of thinking about this that is helpful to a certain extent, but maybe also potentially misleading, which is counterfactual history. How is history against the grain not counterfactual history? Of course, it has a counterfactual character to it, meaning if things had only gone one way instead of another way. Now, why is that important? Because, in fact, what we do matters. Right? So this goes back to the automaton. What we do actually matters. So when the German communists said, after Hitler us, they were basically excusing their own inaction, or really excusing their action. And what was their action? Their action was their refusal to unite with the Social Democrats to stop the Nazis. Now, would that have worked? Who knows? Right? But the idea that, well, it doesn't matter if Hitler comes to power because it's just, they can't possibly hold power, their program makes no sense, and it's just part of the revolutionary crisis, and after them, us. Okay. Well, in a sense, that's always true. In a sense, that's always true, and that's why he refers to the state of emergency. Right? But the state of emergency is not something that happens, but it's perpetual throughout this entire historical period of capitalism. If you recall the fire alarm, right, that it's constantly going off, and also the end of the surrealism essay where he says that, it's the clock face that is constantly like telling the same time, no matter what time it is. So we have these images beforehand. Pablo, I don't know if did that clarify?
Yes, it did. Thank you.
Okay, hopefully we'll fill in even more as we proceed. Okay, so I wanted to start with the Angelus Novus, the Paul Klee painting. That's a strange painting. I don't know if it's a great painting yet. Oh, it's a drawing.
It's a monotype, actually. And I'm a print specialist, so just the only reason I care is that it's not painting.
Well, what do you mean by a monotype?
It's a trace monotype, so he rolled out a slab of ink and then he put his paper face down on it and then he drew on the back of it.
Uh-huh.
So it's actually an appearance through reversal, and then, did a little hand coloring.
So it's supposed to have the quality of like a commercial print?
To some extent, I think it just matters that it went from his hand and it wasn't a direct act of mark making on, like the lines are not ones he made with a pencil or a brush, they were made through the back and it was a active transfer and reversal.
What does that do to the quality of the mark?
It makes it, trace monotypes usually look a little bit sketchy and a little bit, I think bad at explaining it. like, it doesn't look consistent. It's not gonna look like a
Shimmery.
consistent- Yeah, a little bit shimmery or,
Huh, okay.
Sorry.
So is that like, kind of like, what looks like charcoal or something? Is that like resin?
That might have just
residual
been
ink or
charcoal.
something?
He did it, but that does happen a lot.
Yeah, that's
If you put your
post-coloring,
bottom on
right?
the edge of it, it'll like, yeah, well, that was my anal aside. I just, have to
Well,
speak
you
up.
know, a painting is a painting. No, meaning the definition of painting is pigment on surface. Meaning it doesn't matter how it's made. Meaning drawing, watercolor, acrylic, oil, all very, very different. But it's all painting. Charcoal is, I guess, drawing. It's illustration. It's drawing. This is drawing, not painting. It's painting. Pigment on a surface, especially in the modern era when we have all sorts of stuff, right? But Paul Klee was a painter. He was a painter. But yes, okay, so it's not actually a painting. There's no watercolor involved?
There might be a little bit.
It's a strange painting. So, a couple of things about this. So, he talks about in the Paralipomena, the model for it, that it might have been based on a image of the Kaiser Wilhelm, because it has a suggestion of the upturned mustache. But for our purposes, it's got this convention from painting, which is the eyes that meet the spectator, but how do you create the illusion of the painting looking back at the viewer by making the slightly wall-eyed, right? So it's like an exaggerated version of what you normally would do, right? So the way you normally do that, create that illusion, it would make the slightly wall-eyed, but this is like very wall-eyed, right? So it sort of emphasizes, and also in easel painting, like you have to maintain the illusion of a head-on effect, even if you're not head-on, right? That's the other reason why it has to be a little bit wall-eyed. He attributes to this the illusion of motion, right? Which otherwise is a little bit difficult to see. And also, so looking at you, looking past you, looking through you, that effect, which we've touched on earlier in the course via the Baudelaire, the To a Passerby poem. Yes, it's important that the angel is looking at the viewer, because then what Benjamin says the angel is looking at is us. But again, in a kind of metaphorical sense. Okay. My wing is ready for flight. I would like to turn back. If I stayed timeless time, I would have little luck. So that's a poem by Gerhard Scholem, who's Benjamin's friend, on this, like greetings from the angel. A clay painting named Angelus Novus shows an angel looking as though he is about to move away from something he is fixedly contemplating. His eyes are staring, his mouth is open, his wings are spread. This is how one pictures the angel of history. His face is turned towards the past, where we perceive a chain of events. He sees one single catastrophe which keeps piling wreckage upon wreckage and hurls it in front of his feet. The angel would like to stay, awaken the dead, and make whole what has been smashed. But a storm is blowing from paradise. It has got caught in his wings with such violence that the angel can no longer close them. The storm irresistibly propels him into the future to which his back is turned, while the pile of debris before him grows skyward. The storm is what we call progress. All right, so a couple of things. So first of all, the angel of history has a perspective that's not our own. It's not ours. So what people have done with this is that they've turned this into like our view of history. No, this is the view of history that we cannot have. That precisely we cannot have. Why? Because the angel of history is outside of time and contemplating time from outside, in which case all of history becomes one thing. So not a chain of events, but one thing. It's a growing pile of wreckage. The other thing is that his face is turned towards the past. He's the angel of history. Our face is turned towards the future, or not towards the past. So it's a reversal of viewpoint. And again, the messianic, the restitutio in integrum. So what the angel of history represents is the messianic potential kingdom of God at the end of historical time, in which everything that has died will be resurrected. All unhappiness will be redeemed as happiness. Right?
May I ask,
Yeah.
when we are talking about this one single catastrophe, isn't this universal history that impossibility of which Benjamin writes about in Convolute N?
Right, well, we'll see also what he says about universal history here. So here's the other thing that poor Benjamin is saddled with. He's saddled with postmodernism. He's not postmodernist, meaning the postmodernists are against universal history. Benjamin, no. Now, so the issue is, what's the status of universal history? So if Kant and Hegel had their notion of universal history, how does that become problematical in capitalism? Because Kant and Hegel are not living in capitalism. They're living in bourgeois society. They're living in bourgeois emancipation. They're living in bourgeois freedom. So their vision of universal history, or what Hegel called progress in consciousness and freedom, or philosophical history, meaning what does it all amount to? That's universal history. What does it all amount to? What does everything amount to? Both is and is not the case in capitalism. Can't simply be the case in capitalism. Right, so again, capitalism would seem to falsify universal history. Capitalism falsifies universal history. And instead create this demand for redemption. In a way that, again, the Enlightenment, I use Jefferson as the example. The idea is that actually we don't have to redeem history. We can just put it behind us. So capitalism is both of those things. It's the attempt to sort of reset, to sort of start the world anew again in every present moment, but also accumulate the value of the past.
What makes it a new angel if it's always looking? It's the Angelus Novus if it's always looking towards the past.
Well, Angelus Novus is the title that Clay gave it, whereas Benjamin's interpretation of it in this crazy essay has nothing to do with whatever Paul Clay wanted the painting to mean or the image to mean. Yeah. So the new angel, again, we have the provenance, the speculated provenance of the image itself. Poor Kaiser Wilhelm. Because he's blamed for everything, right? He's blamed for World War I. And maybe he was responsible, but no, not really. It was the other. It was the German high command. It was the military. It was Moltke, and it was Bethmann Holbach, the chancellor. They had the plan for World War I. So why is this important? So he was the Kaiser during the time of the SPD, before World War I. He was the one who put an end to the criminalization of the SPD. So he ended Bismarck's proscription of the socialists. So he lifted the ban on the socialists. He wanted it to be seen as a progressive, and Wilhelmine Germany was liberal in comparison to what came before, right? And yet, nonetheless, led to World War I, and then even after World War I, then he became like a crazy, like kind of anti-Semite, nationalist, pro-fascist, right? But he was not that before World War I. So he's this kind of paradoxical figure. And so the fact that this angel image by Klee might be based on Kaiser Wilhelm is a complicated reference. Meaning, of course, from the standpoint of the victorious allies, the Entente, he's just a villain. He's just bad. He's just like this evil guy. Symbolizes German militarism, etc., etc. Actually, it's more complicated than that. It's far more complicated than that. And he's like a tragic figure too. So he's not Hitler. He's not already Hitler. No. Right. So whatever Paul Klee was working through with that imagery, it was complex. Right. It was not like, oh, here's Kaiser Wilhelm. No, obviously not. But the new angel. Okay, so let's also talk about the angel. So. Let's have as our counterexample these angels. Yes? Raphael, yes. Who's like the bourgeois Renaissance painter par excellence. Okay, so now why do I use this one? Because this is like religious imagery on the one hand, also not religious imagery. Meaning this is very humanistic, like kind of reinterpretation of religious imagery. And part of that has to do with the way they're looking. Right? They look like curious children. So do you guys know the notion of the votive angel? The votive angel? So anyway, it's old style Catholic kind of Christianity. So that you might pray to a saint or pray to your votive angel, meaning the idea that there's an angel that's watching over you.
Protector angel.
Yeah, it's the angel that's watching over you. Right? So the idea that the angel watching over you might be looking at you in horror, that's like not good. Right? Like obviously, like you don't want the angel that's watching over you to be looking upon you in horror. That would be pretty condemnatory. That would be pretty bad. Right? So, you know, but clearly it does seem to be the case. Does seem to be the case. Meaning this is like a frightful image. And so he's sort of
He's
kind of a
watching
frightening
catastrophe.
Yes. But also, like, you know, again, Benjamin's adding a lot to it, but just in a very basic sense, it's like, oh shit, like what the fuck just happened? Like you know, like, fuck, you know. So, you know, Benjamin is giving it this like deep, like the winds flowing from paradise. But it might just be the angel is just like, oh fuck, what just happened to my charge? I was watching over poor Walter Benjamin, and then oh fuck, what just happened?
Do you know the thing about the Martin Luther engraving?
Say more? No, I don't.
In 2015, they discovered that Klee had actually pasted it on top of a 18th Brigade engraving of Martin Luther.
Oh, so there's a Martin Luther behind that?
Yes. Yeah.
And Bourneuf from
It's glued right on top of it.
There is a
Really?
book on Angelus Novus written by Anne Bourneuf from our art history department, where she explores that.
Her most recent book.
Oh, okay.
Is all about that? Like, just
Martin Luther.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I mean that's so Kaiser Wilhelm and Martin Luther, but really Martin Luther, not Kaiser Wilhelm.
And the question was, Benjamin lived with this piece unglazed for a very long period of time. Did he at some point peel up the corner? Was he aware that there was an image of Martin Luther behind those? Which, who's to say?
Right. Would that have been possible without destroying it?
Yeah.
It would have been possible? Okay. Now that would have been a popular image of Martin Luther?
Yeah, so it was a 1838 engraving of Martin Luther after Lucas Cranach, who was like a German Renaissance painter. So it was a...
How do you spell Cranach?
Cranach.
Cranach. Cranach. See what comes up.
Oh. Okay. eBay. Wait. So this is, so there's an engraving. Let's see. This is very different. Let's see. Okay, so this is the famous, I know this painting. That's a famous painting. But then there's the, so it wouldn't be this. It would be rather, let's see.
Oh, if you just Google image search Angelus Novus Martin Luther engraving, there's a hyperallergic article.
Oh my goodness.
Did you say wrote the book?
Andy Bornoff.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's copies lying around.
What's behind the Angel of History?
Yeah, scroll down. It's in the side.
That's a strange, like, change of color. Okay. Yoko Ono. What's behind Angelus Novus? Yoko Ono.
We got it. Sorry for the digression. I just think it's when I learned that I was like, what?
Mm-hmm. Is that based on the Lucas Cranach painting though?
That's what
No.
That's what Wikipedia told me.
Yeah, because the
No,
Lucas
no,
Cranach
it's true.
painted. No, I mean this is also saying that, but the Cranach painting is like he's got the hat and he's got the. I
Like
guess it's still the black thing.
It's a painting based on, so
Yeah,
it's
it
after,
doesn't. Yeah.
Right, I see.
Yeah.
Because I guess maybe that was the only image that people had. Is the Cranach. This one. Why does this look very different? Each version seems a little bit different. Like, what is this AIization? Do you know? No, because this is a famous painting.
Mhm.
Right? This is like a very, very famous painting. I guess this is one of the only like images of Martin Luther or something that we have. Right? This is like a famous portrait. Right, I guess it's somewhat similar. It's pretty different. This is much more like kind of scholarly, kind of like yeah, but just the look on his face is different. You know, it's like this is. Do you see like this guy is like a bourgeois, kick-ass, like he's like a Medici, like he's like a Borgia, like a
Cutrone.
total, you know.
It's so ironic that he like pastes this over the character that is basically the main reason for the unfolding catastrophe of capitalism. Yeah.
Martin Luther is not responsible. No, God is responsible. Martin Luther is just the prophet. He's not actually responsible. No, Martin Luther. I don't have a strong opinion of Martin Luther, but yeah, it's not. Capitalism wasn't caused by a theological revision. It was a theological revision necessitated by bourgeois emancipation. Well, speaking of which, should I skip this one? limited time. Okay, let's do this one. The conformism, which has been part and parcel of social democracy from the beginning, attaches not only to its political tactics but to its economic views as well. It is one reason for its later breakdown. Nothing has corrupted the German working class so much as the notion that it was moving with the current. It regarded technological developments as the fall of the stream with which it thought it was moving. From there was but a step to the illusion that the factory work, which was supposed to tend towards technological progress, constituted a political achievement. The old Protestant ethics of work was resurrected among German workers in secularized form. The Gotha program already bears traces of this confusion. So that's the program that established the SPD in 1875. Defining labor as the source of all wealth and all culture. Smelling a rat, Marx countered that the man who possesses no other property than his labor power must of necessity become the slave of other men who have made themselves the owners. However, confusion spread, and soon thereafter Joseph Dietzken proclaimed, the savior of modern times is called work. The improvement of labor constitutes the wealth which is now able to accomplish what no redeemer has ever been able to do. This vulgar Marxist conception of the nature of labor bypasses the question of how its products might benefit the workers while still not being at their disposal. It recognizes only progress in the mastery of nature, not the retrogression of society. It already displays the technocratic features later encountered in fascism. Among these is the conception of nature which differs ominously from the one in the socialist utopias before the 1848 revolution. The new conception of labor amounts to the exploitation of nature, which with naive complacency is contrasted with the exploitation of the proletariat. Compared with this positivistic conception, Fourier's fantasies, which have so often been ridiculed, proved to be surprisingly sound. According to Fourier, as a result of efficient cooperative labor, 4 moons would illuminate the earthly night, the ice would recede from the poles, seawater would no longer taste salty, and beasts of prey would do man's bidding. All this illustrates a kind of labor which, far from exploiting nature, is capable of delivering her of the creations which lie dormant in her womb as potentials. Nature, which as Dietzken puts it, exists gratis, is a complement to the corrupted conception of labor. So what Marx actually said, he also said, maybe more on point, like if I was Benjamin's buddy, I would have said, there's actually a better Marx quote from the Critique of the Gotha program. And that would have just been straightforwardly, the Marx is like, labor is not the source of all wealth, so is nature. So that would be like extremely on point. Right? And also the labor of the past, of nature as well. We need history, but not the way a spoiled loafer in the garden of knowledge needs it. So that's from the Nietzsche essay that we read. Not man or men, but the struggling oppressed class itself is the depository of historical knowledge. In Marx, it appears as the last enslaved class, as the avenger that completes the task of liberation in the name of generations of the downtrodden. This conviction, which had a brief resurgence in the Spartacist group, that's Rosa Luxemburg, has always been objectionable to social democrats. Within 3 decades, they managed virtually to erase the noun of Blanqui, though it had been the rallying sound that had reverberated through the preceding century. Social democracy thought fit to assign to the working class the role of the redeemer of future generations. In this way, cutting the sinews of its greatest strength. This training made the working class forget both its hatred and its spirit of sacrifice, for both are nourished by the image of enslaved ancestors rather than that of liberated grandchildren. Now, I want to say something about this because also in the Paralipomena, he has the locomotive of history, like revolution is the locomotive of history versus revolution being pulling the emergency brake on the locomotive of history. It looks like he's setting up an either or. What if it's both? Like what if revolution is locomotive of history, but also pulling the emergency brake on the locomotive of history? Similarly, of course, liberated grandchildren is the motivation for the revolution, but also redeeming the sacrifices of the past. right? So it seems like he's setting up an active war, but that would be a misapprehension. Again, the question is sacrifice. In what name sacrifice is being done? If it's being done in the name of progress, then that would look like the same sacrifice that capitalism itself demands. Okay, here's Wilhelm Wittgen, The Religion of Social Democracy. Every day our cause becomes clearer and people get smarter. Obviously not. Obviously not. Obviously the cause becomes more obscure and people get stupider. I testify to that. Social democratic theory, and even more its practice, have been formed by a conception of progress which did not adhere to reality, but made dogmatic claims. Progress, as pictured in the minds of social democrats, was first of all the progress of mankind itself, and not just advances in man's ability and knowledge. Secondly, it was something boundless, in keeping with the infinite perfectibility of mankind. Thirdly, progress was regarded as irresistible, something that automatically pursued a straight or spiral course. Each of these predicates is controversial and open to criticism. However, when the chips are down, criticism must penetrate beyond these predicates and focus on something that they have in common. The concept of the historical progress of mankind cannot be sundered from the concept of its progression through a homogeneous, empty time. A critique of the concept of such a progression must be the basis of any criticism of the concept of progress itself. Okay, so this phrase, homogeneous, empty time, it's not redundant. It's not redundant, meaning homogeneous does not equal empty. And the reason for that is that he has the opposite. He has homogeneous full time. And that's every second is the straight gate through which the Messiah might enter. So homogeneous time is contradictory. It's simultaneously empty and full. Otherwise, we're going to think, oh, homogeneous time is empty and heterogeneous time is full. No, that would be the kind of romantic postmodernist bias, because we don't like homogeneity. But maybe homogeneity is the only hope. Okay, origin is the goal, and homogeneous means from the same source, right? So homogeneous doesn't mean everything is the same. It means all from the same source. Heterogeneous means from different sources. So what if all time is from the same source, namely capitalism? Well, what are we going to do with that? Origin is the goal. This is Karl Kraus, and that's one of his funny inversions. Remember we read how he does these aphorisms where he flips at the commonsensical phrase. History is the subject of a structure whose site is not homogeneous empty time, but time filled by the presence of the now time. Thus, to Robespierre, ancient Rome was a past charged with the time of the now, which he blasted out of the continuum of history. The French Revolution viewed itself as Rome reincarnate. It evoked ancient Rome the way fashion evokes costumes of the past. Fashion has a flair for the topical, no matter where it stirs in the thickets of long ago. It is a tiger's leap into the past. This jump, however, takes place in an arena where the ruling class gives the commands. The same leap in the open air of history is the dialectical one, which is how Marx understood the revolution. Meaning, it's not a tiger's leap into the future as opposed to a tiger's leap into the past. It's a tiger's leap into the past, but in a different direction. Right, so the revolution is a leap into the past, but different from the one that takes place where the ruling class gives the commands. Now, why is this the case? So he's repeating here something from Marx's 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, which is that history appears twice, first as tragedy, second as farce, and that the bourgeois revolutions had to, speaking of Luther, Martin Luther, that the early bourgeois revolutions of the Protestant revolt and the Dutch revolt against the Spanish monarchy and also the English Civil War all thought of themselves as restoring Christianity. So they were doing something new and different, but they thought of themselves as returning to the past. Fast forward to the 1700s, the French Revolution thought of itself as the restoration of the Roman Republic via the Jacobins. So that is tragic, according to Marx. It's a tragic misapprehension. And what Marx wrote there in the 18th Brumaire was that in the bourgeois revolution, the phrase goes beyond the content, whereas in the 19th century, in 1848, the content goes beyond the phrase. And that rather than trying to act on the basis of the past, one needs to take one's poetry from the future. Again, what that means, unclear. Poetry from the future, though, meaning obviously inspiration, spirit, rather than like literal futurism. And then he follows up in this idea of blasting the continuum of history. The awareness that they are about to make the continuum of history explode is characteristic of the revolutionary classes at the moment of their action. The Great Revolution introduced a new calendar. That's the 1789 French Revolution. The initial day of a calendar serves as a historical time-lapse camera. And basically, it is the same day that keeps recurring in the guise of holidays, which are days of remembrance. Thus, the calendars do not measure time as clocks do. They are monuments of a historical consciousness of which not the slightest trace has been apparent in Europe in the past 100 years. So since the 1840s. In the July Revolution, prior to that, that's 1830, an incident occurred which showed this consciousness still alive. On the first evening of fighting, it turned out the clocks and towers were being fired on simultaneously and independently from several places in Paris. An eyewitness who may have owed his insight to the rhyme wrote as follows: "Who would have believed it? We are told that new Joshuas at the foot of every tower, as though irritated with time itself, fired at the dials in order to stop the day." So obviously this is it resonates with the idea of pulling the emergency brake of the locomotive history. So again, clock time versus calendar time. But historical materialists cannot do without the notion of a present, which is not in transition, but in which time stands still and has come to a stop. For this notion defines the present in which he himself is writing history. Historicism gives the eternal image of the past. Historical materialism supplies a unique experience with the past. The historical materialist leaves it to others to be drained by the whore called Once Upon a Time in historicism's bordello. He remains in control of his powers, man enough to blast the continuum of history. Okay. So why would we be drained by Once Upon a Time? Right, because that would be like historicism's bordello is essentially like you go to history in order to expend the energy of the present. Right? So it's just, it turns history into something that you contemplate rather than something that is inciting to action. Right? So it leaves history as it is, as opposed to blasting it open. Historicism rightly culminates in universal history. Materialistic historiography differs from it as to method more clearly than any other kind. Universal history has no theoretical armature. Its method is additive. It musters a mass of data to fill the homogeneous empty time. Materialistic historiography, on the other hand, is based on a constructive principle. Thinking involves not only the flow of thoughts, but their arrest as well. Where thinking suddenly stops in a configuration pregnant with tensions, it gives that configuration a shock, by which it crystallizes into a monad. And I think we talked about the monad.
Mm-hmm.
A historical materialist approaches a historical subject only where he encounters it as a monad. In this structure, he recognized the sign of a messianic cessation of happening, or put differently, a revolutionary chance in the fight for the oppressed past. He takes cognizance of it in order to blast a specific era out of the homogeneous course of history, blasting a specific life out of the era, or a specific work out of the life work. As a result of this method, the life work is preserved in this work, and at the same time canceled. So this would be a sublation. This would be the both realized and negated, or fulfilled and abolished. In the life work, the era. So in the life work, the era is both preserved and canceled, and in the era, the entire course of history is both preserved and canceled, or it's sublated. It's overcome. That would be the other term for Nietzsche. The nourishing fruit of the historically understood contains time as a precious but tasteless seed. Okay, so again, historicism would not just be a matter of understanding, and the historical materialism would not be the understanding of historicism, because historicism is keeping all the moments of the past precious but tasteless. Right, so again, it's two different ways of realizing the value of the past. Historicism versus historical materialism. And then we'll see, he's going to give some more substance to this idea of blasting the continuum. In relation to the history of organic life on Earth, writes a modern biologist, the paltry 50 millennia of Homo sapiens constitute something like 2 seconds at the close of a 24-hour day. On this scale, the history of civilized mankind would fill 1/5 of the last second of the last hour. The present, which is the model of messianic time, comprises the entire history of mankind in an enormous abridgment. Coincides exactly with the stature which the history of mankind has in the universe. Right, so you get an accumulation of time that's also a kind of concentration, a condensation of time. So earlier he had the time-lapse photography. Historicism contents itself with establishing a causal connection between various moments in history. But no fact that is a cause is for that very reason historical. It became historical posthumously, as it were, through events that may be separated from it by thousands of years. And by the way, this is where he agrees with Hegel. Hegel thinks that history, philosophical history, is post festum, it's retrospective. A historian who takes this as his point of departure stops telling the sequence of events like the beads of a rosary. Instead, he grasps the constellation, which his own era has formed with a definite earlier one. Thus he establishes a conception of the present as the time of the now, which is shot through with chips of messianic time. Right, so we had construction, now we have constellation. The relation of those two is important. So constellation appears to be spontaneous, whereas construction seems to be intentional. So the point is to take the constellation and turn it into a construction. And the beads of a rosary, that's just like marking time. Right? That's what that's supposed to suggest. The soothsayers, or fortune tellers, who found out from time what it had in store, certainly did not experience time as either homogeneous or empty. Anyone who keeps this in mind will perhaps get an idea of how past times were experienced in remembrance, namely in just the same way. We know that the Jews were prohibited from investigating the future. The Torah and the prayers instruct them in remembrance, however. This stripped the future of its magic, to which all those succumb who turn to the fortune tellers for enlightenment. This does not imply, however, that for the Jews the future turned into homogeneous empty time. No, for every second of time was the straight gate through which the Messiah might enter, meaning homogeneous full time. Now, of course, what he's talking about there is post diaspora. This is after the destruction of the second temple. So it's the diaspora. So in the diaspora, they're prohibited from investigating the future. Right. That wasn't necessarily the case before that, but rather instructed in remembrance. So, right. So again, the remembrance and every second of time in the present and in the past becomes a straight gate through which the Messiah might enter. Right, so again, that potential, that possibility. And that's meant to mirror the shot through with Messianic, with chips of Messianic time. So this week I called this class session Time of the Now. That's the Yetzite, the now time, right? So it can be rendered. Now time is better. Time of the now is also suggested in good ways. But the now time, meaning that how is the past present? And how is the present already past? Right. So, again, that's the constellation between the past and the present that needs to be turned into a construction, into an active construction. So we're going to accept how the past flashes up in a moment of danger, where what is the danger? The danger of it being irretrievably lost, even the dead are not safe. And so why does it appear that way? Because it appears as a demand for redemption that appears only now, meaning with a kind of urgency in the present. At the same time, potentially every moment is this. Right, so when he said about the state of emergency, that the state of emergency isn't coming, it isn't in the past or the future, it's present, and the point is to turn it into a real state of emergency. Right, so capitalism is the state of emergency, but it's not the state of the emergence of something new and different unless we make it that. So this is what he thinks, if he had written the Arcades Project, what he thinks its message would have been. So what would have been the message of this history of the 19th century? It would have been precisely that we're living in the same time, same state of emergency and under the same task. And the past would be appearing in the present, that 19th century history repeating in the 20th century as like tasking us. Are we going to redeem this, or are we not? That's why he brings up the forgotten socialists like Blanqui and utopian socialists. That's the other point, because of course the Marxists, in their complacency, simply assumed that they had surpassed the socialism of the 19th century, the pre-Marxist or non-Marxist socialism. It turns out that's a kind of repressed content of the 19th century that demanded redemption. It's also important that Blanqui, Lenin was accused of being both Blanqui and Bakunin. So if you remember, Bakunin was invoked in the Surrealism essay, Blanqui is invoked here. This is because it was Lenin who the Social Democrats accused of being a Blanquist or a Bakuninist. And so Benjamin's point is, okay, so what are they saying? What is this history that they want to repress in condemning Lenin? In condemning the revolution. So we did it.
Yeah.
Huh?
We did it.
We did it. So now you guys know what it means.
That's easy.
or do you? No. You have the some handle on it, right? So that's my goal pedagogically, is to give you this material, give you a handle on it, and then whatever it might mean to you going forward. But at least you'll be grasping it for what it is, and not for some bizarre cargo cult like free association, whatever people do with it. Whatever they, yeah, I guess what you said was that they treat it as literature. Right. That they pick up Benjamin as if it's literature. It's critical theory. It's Marxism. Useful, not useful, who knows? But it's obviously only going to be useful in its actual meaning. So it's not going to be useful in its kind of free association, bong hit meaning. Right. Now this is a phrase that a friend of mine came up with, bong hit Marxism. It's like reading Marxism between bong hits. It's like, no. And anyway, Benjamin already told us that revolutionary discipline is like the highest mysticism, and it's closest to religion. It's not like smoking hashish. Sorry.
Thank you.
All right, guys. So I hope this semester has been wrapping up well. This is your last class, I assume?
Yeah.
All right, so I'll be looking forward to the papers. Have a good break. Have a good new year, and I'll see some of you in the future.
Thank you, Chris.
Thanks.